Overcrowdedness, it's a big word, and we heard so much about it today. We heard about the importance of controlling and the importance of keeping track of demographics. And that's very important for many reasons, because there is business advertising, there is labor market, there is social security planning. There is also the need of feeding the world. We heard so many things about it. And indeed, this motivates the creation of plenty of institutions that take care of that keep track of this information throughout the world. All this comes together in generating a huge amount of data. And not only that, also a large number of tools that are very useful for keeping track of these facts. And in fact, there are so many answers that can be provided today. We heard many of them today, and some others can actually be attempted, maybe with a little bit of imagination. Some people in the 70s were saying, okay, if we could figure out how many people have ever lived on the face of this earth, maybe we could prove the fact that 70% of all those people are still alive today. Someone said that. And of course, it wasn't true. But in order to prove that that wasn't true, very important, the Population Reference Bureau in the USA had to think very hard about it. So the question of how many people have ever lived on Earth has been lingering around for quite a long time. And quite recently, there was an answer. And the number, there was a sort of a ballpark number, was 108 billion people. And this also was providing us an answer to the fact that 6.5% of those 108 billion people are actually alive today. That's interesting. I think it's a very interesting number because it kind of proves two things. First of all, that overcrowdedness is a big problem. We're living it every day. And also the fact that, well, fortunately, many of these people have actually, this number has spiked up only in the past few years. Now, if we were to ask the same kind of question in the case of music, the situation would be quite different. It would be very difficult to answer how many musical pieces have ever been written since the dawn of time. And most of all because there wasn't, until not so long ago, much motivation in keeping track of these numbers. And so using the powers that I'm endowed with my institution of belonging, I wanted to go and find out how many pieces, somehow using the means that I was offered by the Politecnico, and I Googled it. And what came out wasn't much information. I had lots of very random numbers, like this one, and if this number were completely true, we would probably be all music writers, and we would probably be producing like 6,000 musical pieces, each one of us, considering the 108 billion people that have ever populated the Earth since the dawn of time. But many other numbers came up, and none of them actually did make any sense. They were all completely random, and and none of them could be trusted in any way. So the question remains, but does it really matter? Well, what matters today more and more is how much is actually out there. And so to have more like a number that gives you a bit more of the idea of how many musical pieces have ever been written, I thought, well, I'm pretty good with arithmetics, should be my job in principle. So I went back with the 108 billion people that populated the Earth, and I figured maybe some way to do a little bit of arithmetics with that. So by looking at the numbers coming from the Labor Bureau in the US, I tried to figure out how many composers are in the US, and more or less I got 1 out of 2,500 people. Then I tried to use some scaling numbers that would tell me that perhaps we should account for the fact that there were some acceleration factors. People were not writing so much music before as they are today. And so at the end, we figured that there should be more or less 10 million songwriter-composers within the whole population of 108 billion people that have populated the Earth. And if you consider more or less the productivity of each one of those composers, maybe 5 to 25 songs a year over a lifespan of 20 years, we get finally a range, a ballpark range of number of musical pieces that are actually that have been written in the history of time. And we come up with a number that goes from 1 to 5 billion musical pieces ever written. That's a lot of music. It's a lot of music. And of all that music, well, there isn't much out there. We think, with Spotify, with iTunes, that there is a lot of music out there. But in comparison to what actually has been written is very little for a variety of reasons. So if we want to find out how much music is out there, perhaps we could do a little experiment. And there is, for example, there is Paul Mawini, who started his record collection in 1951, and he was pretty good at that. He had a shop, basically, that he opened back then, and he died like many other shops of the sort in around 2008. It folded, but in the meantime, for every record that he sold, he took one of those records and put it aside into his collection, amounting to an amazing collection, and he was even able to put together a directory with all the vinyl records that had ever been collected by him. And at the end, he was able to double the size of the collection of the Library of Congress, and even go triple that in 2008, with 3 million items collected by himself. Now, the question is that completely something that covers very uniformly the collection of music that is available in the world? Well, the answer, no. The answer is no. And in fact, there was a study done by the Library of Congress that found out that only 17% of the titles of this collection are actually available on CD, and even fewer of those are available in the form of streaming, of some sort of streaming, so they're accessible via internet. And what worries me the most is the fact that only American and UK recordings belong to that collection. And the situation is not so different when you go online. The situation is slowly changing, hopefully, but if you just look at iTunes or Spotify to talk about things that are available in Italy, what we find is that there are 26 million songs, so we're we're talking about 2 orders of magnitude below what my estimate was before. It's about 100 terabytes of data, which fits in that unit that you see behind my shoulders. And it's a total of 2.5 lifespans of continuous listening of different music. That's pretty interesting because despite the limitation of this collection, we still have a lot of information to navigate through. And how do we do that? How do we navigate through that? And is navigating the right word? How do we search for music? How do we pick the music we like? Well, first of all, the word searching is a difficult word. It's a difficult word because we don't know how to search for music. And searching for music is very hard for many reasons. First of all, we don't usually know what we want or what we like. That's the first question. It's very hard to say. For most of us, it is like that. And we also don't know how to describe the music that we want. We don't have the words. We have words that are very vague. We also have words that are very subjective. And so we end up using words like genre, mood, whatever it is. And at the end, what we do is to just whistle the tune or maybe try to suggest something else, use examples or whatever it is that we can put our hands on. The other thing is that labels are often wrong or limiting, so that doesn't really help either. For example, sometimes you have the same style of music played by 2 different musicians, and they get cataloged in a completely different way. One is considered a jazz musician, the other is considered a country musician, but they, pretty much do the same things in different ways, of course. And there are also situations where musicians ride boundaries and try to hover above them, because it's exactly by navigating the boundaries that you get a little bit of surprise in the listener. And in some other cases, again, you try to cross the boundary and you don't want to be categorized for that. You like to be your own person. You want your individuality, so labels don't fit you well on it. So this is why it's really hard to use labels to search for music. And it's also difficult to display the information using such labels. We did a little bit of an experiment in our laboratory, and so Massimiliano Zanoni, who was a PhD student back then, developed a little browser. It was a very simple browser. It was an emotional browser. On the horizontal plane, you have the level of activity. It's called arousal, and on the vertical plane, you have positivity. So basically, the valence of the musical piece. So depending on where you are in this diagram, you decide whether you are happy on the first quadrant, whether you are angry on the second quadrant, whether you are sad or depressed on the third quadrant, or whether you are, there are all these moods that are described that way. You also can navigate, you can create trajectories of mood in space depending on where you are in the song. So for this particular example, you start fairly neutral, and then you move on at the end of the intro, and the activity grows, and so on. So it can be useful, but does it really help finding the music you want? Can you actually describe your mood or what you are in the mood for? That's not an easy answer to provide. This is why we also attempted, through the work of Michele Buccoli, another PhD student of our lab, the idea of trying to use semantics to search for music. So try to develop sort of a mini Google version that accepts description given in terms of, semantics. So you describe what you want, and through some descriptions, you end up getting, a playlist that tries to match that description, even maybe taking into account the context. When you use the word warm, did you mean timbral? Did you mean, I don't know, something related to the content of the music, more into the structure of the music? But anyway, the experiment worked, but we also found very soon that it was insufficient for searching for music. And the other possibility was also to use expert descriptions. So some of us, people that know how to play musical instruments, describe chords, describe rhythms, might want to use that kind of description, which is kind of cool. You can say, okay, I want something that is a shuffle and is minor and then has a 251 resolution. Well, that's kind of complicated and technical, and not many of us can actually do this kind of stuff. There are systems can actually analyze the content and give you that kind of information. But is that what we really want to do? Do we really like searching for content? Or do we prefer being told what to look for, what to listen to? As a matter of fact, to answer this kind of question is not so easy. And so we might want to ask ourselves how it worked before. So when I was a youngster, I remember what I was doing. I remember I was, listening to the friends, and we were just talking about music. We were listening to music in front of a big stereo. The only one that there was only one friend of mine that had a stereo, so we were all in this place. And listening to the radio, suggestions of DJs, music programs, and so on. Then there was the guru guy. The guru guy was quite amazing because he would read through everybody in the store. I would walk in, say if he had anything interesting for me, he would look through me, look at the way I was dressed, the way I was walking, and then come up with a nice idea, and it worked. It worked every time. So it was quite amazing. Until stores became bigger and the gurus disappeared, and we were spending hours searching through 10,000 records without finding anything at all. That was the era when the records were still being sold and CDs were still being sold. And eventually, they all closed, and we were left with a completely different way of navigating through content in the virtual world, so online. So the question is, how do we keep up to date with music today? And is it relevant? Do we care about keeping up to date in music? Well, there is a study that is kind of interesting that talks about exactly this point. And it's interesting because the adult population seems to care a lot about it. 50% of the population says that it's important to keep up to date with music. And if you consider young adults from 12 to 24, it's even more important. You go to 70% of the population. So those who care, how do they find new music? They find it by looking, again, to suggestions of friends. They, word of mouth, again, is still a pretty valid tool. AM, FM radio, we think that the AM, FM radio are dead. They're not yet. They're still out there, and we still listen to them in the car or wherever we are. And YouTube seems to be a pretty good source of information, and also Pandora, Facebook, Spotify, and Apple iTunes, this sort of thing, seems to be catching up a great deal, especially among the young adults from 12 to 24. The numbers grow even more in that sense. So, well, this actually is telling us that that famous guru guy that I was mentioning before, we need it more than ever. We need him back, or at least we need a virtual guru guy back that tells us what we will like somehow. So, you know, the guru guy knows his music, but he also knows his clients. And therefore, it is no longer sufficient to understand, analyze the content. You also need to understand the listener, understand how the listener enjoys music. And that's not an easy thing to do. And there are many studies that have been done in the past. There are studies on neuroscience that tell us that basically it's a fine balance of the production of dopamine, that is a neurostimulant, and there is a communication that is enhanced. Usually also drugs do that, unfortunately, but music in a way works in a very similar way, and it stimulates the production of neurostimulants and basically creates pleasure. There's a beautiful book that I recently read by Daniel Lavitin, a colleague from McGill University. The title is also quite indicative. This is your brain on music. And basically what he's saying is that you need a certain degree of comfort. You need to know what you're listening to feel comfortable. You know, just as much as you need repetition. You feel comfortable with repetition, but you also need some degree of surprise when you listen to music. Something that breaks with the rules of comfort somehow. And this is why music is so much enjoyable. You will know that the most famous pieces create surprise. For example, Yesterday is a song that has, instead of having multiple of 4 measures, has 7 measures. And that's kind of already, it's a sort of a structural surprise. But also it creates chord progressions that are very unexpected in a way. They don't follow the usual turnarounds that are typical of Bach, the second, fifth, first, and so on. Also, Somewhere Over the Rainbow has big jumps in the melody, which calls for harmonies that go in a completely different direction. All these things are unexpected surprises that stimulate the production of dopamine and serotonin in your brain and makes you feel pleasure. I didn't want to be so, dry in talking about pleasure. And there's definitely much more than simply production of dopamine in your brain. But as you know, numbers are numbers, and since we're crunching numbers right now, it's important to understand how to use these numbers. And in particular, how can we exploit this knowledge? What can we do in order to improve the navigation and the search for good music? Well, answering the question of finding the boundary between what is comfortable and what breaks the rules of comfort is the same as finding how much complexity, whatever form complexity may take, how much complexity we can digest. And so another PhD student from my lab, Bruno Di Giorgi, did an amazing job. He created a little robot, software robot that went around and crawled in all possible websites that had chords and collected a database of almost 500,000 chord transcriptions, an average of 64 chords per song, and went through the whole thing, parsed through, and generated a huge database of information of chord changes in music, in popular music. Now it's extending the same thing to jazz and many other things. And what came up with is a very interesting machine, one of the many machines that he analyzed in order to study how we conceive, for example, harmonic complexity. And he built a state space machine that emulates the chord changes. And he had an interesting, dial that you could turn in this machine. How smart do we make the machine? A machine that knows nothing about music, only 2 states, recognizes the world of major chords and minor chords. But if you add a little more intelligence to the machine, you start recognizing the importance of dominant resolutions, all the things that are typical of modern music somehow. And with 10 states, the constellation grows until with 200 states, suddenly you develop a true constellation of chord changes in this firmament of possibility. And that's very interesting because these are interesting representation of our way of understanding complexity in harmonic situations. But the same thing can actually be done in rhythms. And the ability to map this information corresponds to the ability to map how what is our boundary of understanding things. And recognizing new constellation, it's the joy of discovery in the harmonic world, is actually what procures pleasure in the listener. So music recommendation should go that way, and the future of this should be to analyze not just the complexity of the musical libraries for the sake of it, but also to understand what the listener is able to digest in all those directions. And try to paint a more accurate picture of the person, just like the guru guy was doing, trying to profile you as a person who's able to understand and is knowledgeable about music more or less in various fields. And in particular, recommending the music that best crosses that threshold that you have. In particular, you will be able to avoid suggesting stuff that is too easy because it will be boring. Avoid giving you stuff that is too complex because it will go over your head. And try to just stay there. Just break it just as much as you need to create pleasure. And, the last word that I wanted to say about this is, well, complexity takes many forms. Complexity is about structure, it's about rhythm, it's about harmony, about melody. And the more you can actually break rules in a controlled fashion on all these fronts, the more you will find deeper pleasure in listening to music. That's the reason why, many music enthusiasts are like on drug when they listen to music, especially jazz musicians. Have you ever spoken to a jazz enthusiast? Well, don't talk to a jazz enthusiast because you will be doomed. He will talk to you until tomorrow about that. So here's my message. Try to learn more about the listener and after having learned more about music. Thank you.